We've been locked down for over 5 weeks now. The weeks have been cold and long, but it is now clear that in that time, this wave of COVID has retreated. It's not just the Office for National Statistics reporting a fall. The numbers testing positive are very much down. Indeed, the fall from the peak at the turn of the year is even more pronounced. It's possible one reason for this might be that there are fewer infectious people coming forward for testing, but we're also seeing the situation improve in hospitals.
So hospitalisations are now also going down, and they're going down across the country, as are admission rates into intensive care, and that's also, broadly speaking, going down in all regions. But it's really worth noting that still the hospital admission rate, so that's the number of people, so the rate of people going into hospital, so the proportion of the population going into hospital in any given week is still higher than it was at the peak in November.
The other metric is deaths, which lag behind. In the first wave, they exceeded 1,000 in a single day, once. They fell to a low of 7 a day in August, but hit over 1,300 a day in mid-January. There have been 21 days with over 1,000 deaths in the most recent wave, but they are falling now.
I think deaths have now peaked, but they're still very high. They are coming down, and it's not just deaths that are high, but what we call excess mortality, the number of people dying compared to what would be expected at this time of the year in the average over the past 5 years, and that's still really very high as well. So again, it's getting better. Things are on the right side, but there's still a way to go to seeing any kind of normality.
Well, there have been drops. Cases are still higher in some groups, with the embers still burnt last year. This graph shows COVID infection rates according to wealth. The pink line shows infections among the wealthiest 20% of the population. The green line is for the most deprived 20% of the population. We see that it is in lockdown that a real gulf opens up between the groups. Thoughts are now turning to opening up. Some fear that despite millions of people vaccinated, if we open up too quickly, we risk another lockdown. Scientists are asking how many cases are acceptable, and what does a case mean if people have been vaccinated, so potentially less likely to get sick. This is what the Chief Medical Officer said last month.
The aim of this is to de-risk it as much as possible by the vaccine, to the point where actually we get to the stage where the risk is incredibly low relative to where we are now. I mean, we just say, just as we do with flu, where every year, roughly on an average year, about 7,000 people a year die. In a bad year, up to 20,000 people a year die. We accept there is a level of risk that society will tolerate, and we should tolerate. People die. That's one of the things that happens.
But if something like that is our aim, when can we start coming out of lockdown?
I would say it's far too early to be able to start making any kind of confident judgments around that. And it's going to depend on a lot of things about who gets vaccinated, how quickly, and the impact and the benefit of that vaccine on both transmission, disease severity, and on any new variants that potentially start emerging.
With news that the economy is slumped and the numbers of people vaccinated rapidly going up, the question is, where do we need to be to open up?
Deb Cohen, well, let's talk about that now. Joining me is Richard Horton, editor of the Lancet Medical Journal, and the Conservative MP Damien Green, former First Secretary of State. Good evening to both of you. Richard Horton, first of all, as a society, do you think that we have grasped the impact that COVID will have on us, and for how long?
I'm afraid not at all. I think we've taken far too short-term a perspective. We are in a very good position in the near term. Right now, we've seen over 2/3 of cases cut since January the 4th. We're on target to get to very low numbers of cases by the end of February, early March. That does mean that if we can keep those low number of cases stable, we could see some easing of the lockdown by mid-March, for example, opening primary schools. But that's not the real objective. The real objective is going to be to get the mass of the population vaccinated and go into winter later this year as protected as we can be. But we will see a spike in number of cases going into winter, and we have to have a multi-year perspective to this. It's going to take 2 to 3 to 4 years to build up the levels of population immunity to really protect us.
So you say the words, as protected as we can be. Is that as protected as we can be, or as protected as we're prepared to be?
Right, so we have broadly two choices. We try and suppress transmission as much as possible. This has been called zero COVID. Or we say that that's going to be an impossible dream, a mirage, as Jonathan Sumption has called it. And instead, we're going to have to accept a certain level of deaths, as you heard Chris Whitty say. In fact, the number of deaths from influenza has been as high as 30,000 in any one year in England. Is that the number that we're going to have to accept? And that's going to be a conversation politicians are going to have with the country.
Yes, well, let's have a bit of that conversation with one politician now, Damien Green. Do you think, I mean, Chris Whitty did say it there, but do you think that is a message that the government ought to be telling the people, even though it's hard to hear, that this is about 2 to 3 years, it's about an acceptable level of deaths, and it's possibly about continuing restrictions in one form or another?
Well, I would take those separately. I think I agree with Richard Horton that the idea zero COVID is probably a mirage, that it is going to be with us. We are going to have to live with it. But in practice, looking at the whole of society, if you can vaccinate large parts of the adult population, particularly the most vulnerable 9 groups, which we have caused, have been suffered from 99% of the deaths. And also, the one thing that hasn't been discussed yet, which I know Matt Hancock is talking about in tomorrow's newspapers, is the fact that treatments are coming along so that fewer people will die than have sadly died in the past. The combination of the vaccination program and the treatments might mean and should mean that we can slowly, gradually, cautiously open up with the confidence that we're not going to have to lock down again, even though we know now that winters are more difficult than summers.
So you say slowly, gradually, cautiously, Damien Green, but don't you think we just have to be honest and say, look, you might get into a pub, you might get to the outside of a pub by the beginning of April, you might get into a shop in May. I mean, do people have the expectation that wham bam, it's going to come to like the 5th of March, kids are going to be back in school and everything's going to open up again? And when does the government say that is simply not going to happen?
Well, I mean, the answer is the government will say, the Prime Minister will say, broadly speaking, what his plan is on February the 22nd. We know that. And it does seem to me very likely that the sequence will be that we'll open up the schools in March. It would, I think, be sensible to give it a few weeks to see what effect that has on incidents, and then say maybe retail, outdoor sport, some of the things that some of us have been arguing are relatively safe. You could do that fairly quickly, and then maybe a month after that, see what effect that has, move on to hospitality, to pubs and restaurants and so on. So I think the key principle that we must operate under is that we should unlock sensibly, so that we never have to go back into this type of lockdown. I think another lockdown like this would be disastrous.
Well, Richard Horton, sorry to interrupt. Richard Horton, the vaccine isn't the magic bullet, is it? Because it has to be a global vaccine, or else one of the restrictions we're going to face, presumably, is not being travelling as freely as we once did.
That's right. The unit of success here is not the United Kingdom, it is the whole of the world. And this is a virus that has spread across the whole of the planet. So it's in our interest to make sure that vaccines are made available, not just to our European neighbours, but to other countries around the world. And we're a long, long, long way from that at the moment. So it's great that we've got, I think today the number was over 14 million who've had their first dose. But it's an illusion to think that our success is going to be sufficient to protect us, because even if we do have high levels of population immunity, our borders will not be secure, and we can't keep locking people up in hotels for the next 5 years.
So in that case, Damien Green, then there has to be a very direct conversation with the public, which also affects the economy, which is that travel will not be freely available throughout the world until we have a vaccine throughout the world.
Well, how available it is in the rest of the world, how much we can travel to other countries is up to the other countries as much as anything. And I do think, I mean, we know that we have been, with this brilliantly successful vaccination program, that we have ordered more than you could possibly need for the British public.
Well, we'll be giving it elsewhere then, presumably. We'll be giving it to other countries if we've got excess.
If eventually, yes. And AstraZeneca have said that, they're going to sell it, use it around the world, and not make any profit out of it, which seems to me wholly laudable. So yes, we will help other countries, whether our immediate neighbours or indeed, I would be quite happy to see Britain's effort around the world in some of the poorer countries.
But don't we also have to say that sooner rather than later, people who cannot afford to stay at home, people who have to go out to work, people who have to go out to work because their jobs are so insecure that they will lose them, people are going to have to do that. And also, the government is very keen to say and says furlough is not forever. So, so the question is, how do you marry people's desperate need to go out to work when they're financially insecure with the levels of lockdown release that you're suggesting?
Because what I'm suggesting is I mean, it's gradual in the terms that I'm not saying that, as soon as you've got the first 4 groups vaccinated, you open up the whole economy. There are some people arguing that. I don't agree with that. But I think within a few months, you can open up large parts of the economy. And that would be, if you look at wider society, obviously COVID is dominating everything. But we do have to look at mental health as well as economic health. And that does argue for a gradual return to something like normal life and certainly normal economic activity.
Well, normal economic activity only, presumably, if you make sure that furlough still exists for people who cannot get back to work.
Well, the more normal you can make economic activity, the more people can get back to work. And so, that's good all round. It's better for people to do jobs than sitting at home furloughed. And obviously, given the huge amount of support that the government has given to the economy, we can't carry on borrowing like that.
Thank you.
We will have to have normal economic activity back.
Thank you both very much indeed.